Good afternoon. I will not try to pretend that I can speak or understand the local language. No, I cannot. But even without that, I have some serious questions for the audience to ask. Who of you don't deal with BGP? Who of you do not deal with BGP? Seriously? All right, so for those 2 or 3, you can happily go back to your emails. And for the rest of the group, I have some bad news. Did you know that BGP is insecure and it's basically broken? So, and even with this, if you think that BGP is secure, in fact, it is not. Did I scare you? Right. So seriously, let's discuss one of the aspects of security applications related to BGP as a routing protocol. First, to set a context. This is not about BGP-SEC, this is not about RPKI, this is not about how it doesn't work, or at least works only in academic environments. This is about something else. This is about the BGP transport security. The MD5 password secret, or whatever your favorite vendor names it. And the reason why this is being discussed is the perception in the community that MD5 is no longer cryptographically strong, cryptographically secure for its intended purposes. And therefore, when you talk to the security community and they realize that you are developing a new routing protocol or using the existing one as BGP is, and you use MD5 there, that immediately raises the blood pressure for those nice security experts. And typically the argument comes into the discussion that MD5 has been broken many decades ago and you still continue to use that. Therefore, your routing protocol is broken. Bad, bad, bad. If we look at how BGP interacts with transport and with transport security, in fact, it doesn't. BGP was designed to run over any available transport. Majority of the deployments today use TCP, although there are some say, private implementations, some private deployments which use something else. CTP is probably the closest one. BGP of itself doesn't have anything related to security as such. It just relies on the underlying layers for that. And if we are looking into a BGP-SEC and RPKI, in order for that to be practically usable, there are certain assumptions that the path attributes which are being transported will not be modified by some middle entity. And in order to assure that, you need to actually have working and credible BGP transport security mechanism. That is one of the reasons why MD5 topic is in fact important, that it resurfaces in if we are discussing the practical applicability of BGP-SEC. On the other hand, there needs to be some mechanism which would allow you to at least validate that you're still speaking to the same neighbor as you were speaking before the maintenance window. And that is the actual use for the MD5 authentication there. So today, that's TCP. And TCP has a nice property that anyone with some spare time and some connectivity can actually get into the existing established TCP session rather easily. And if we want to make some harm to the BGP session, we just need to reset it. And that is, in fact, a rather easy thing. You don't need to actually know the exact sequence numbers. The only thing is that you need to guess the window. And by brute forcing that, or even if you have the ability to observe the traffic, that is really trivially done. The industry has responded by developing the Graceful restart mechanism. It was needed for other purposes too, but this is kind of a, say, a side effect of a mechanism which is used for something else. Graceful restart just maintains the routing information which was received, and it maintains that over the session restart. Fine, somebody resets our TCP session, we still have the routes, prefixes, and other attributes available, potentially no harm done. On the other hand, Graceful restart is, the Graceful restart doesn't come for free. Again, this is additional load onto the routers. We are getting into the corner cases when you, for example, get multiple graceful restarts. There needs to be synchronization mechanism across those things and so on. Another important aspect is even if we build a perfectly, say, perfect security mechanism, perfect security transport security mechanism into the routing protocol, if our network design is not necessarily the right one, that probably will not help too much. So this brings the whole set of questions of how do you design a network, filtering, and all sorts of other mechanisms. And quite frequently, I do hear discussions about that. So why don't we invent a perfect security mechanism which will solve all the problems related to BGP? Well, probably you can try to invent such a thing. You will spend a few decades for that. And even with such a mechanism, if somebody designs a network in a broken way, that will just not work. Looking a little bit deeper into the transport authentication mechanisms, that's nothing new. It has been for around 20 years as a minimum, and that's not related to BGP. This is a rather general mechanism. The idea is very simple. You take the payload which is about to be sent, calculate a checksum of that, and carry that checksum in the packet. The only important part is that the checksum is calculated based on the shared secret, which is known by the endpoints, but not known by any other party. And therefore, it's not easily possible to try to recalculate the checksum in case the payload is being modified. And the operation of the remote end is really simple. If the checksum doesn't match, throw away the packet. It does not belong to our session. This solves stray session reset problem really easily. And it is actually universally used. Probably all of you here in this room who are configuring BGP sessions, you are using some form of this mechanism by default. Important aspect to note, this is not information encryption, so the session is still clear text. And if you think that if you configure something on a BGP password or secret, that it encrypts the payload and nobody is able to sniff that on a wire, no, that is not the case. And that's not even the intention. And we can argue that that's not a problem worth to be solved at all. Well, that the information is publicly available anyway. Even if you encrypt the session, all sorts of looking glasses and other public databases will have your advertised information available. If we look into technical details, there are a few options. Of course, there's no authentication, and the one which is universally and widely used is what is called TCP MD5. It works. However, it has a few serious limitations. The perceived cryptographical insecurity of MD5 being one. However, if you tried to change the key on your BGP session without disrupting that session, that probably was an interesting engineering exercise. Yes, it's possible to do that, but that requires quite a bit of coordination on both of the sides. Therefore, both vendor and operator community got together and tried to develop something better, and that resulted in enhanced MD5 mechanism, which allows for key rotation, which allows for key validity intervals. However, this is supported only by a fraction of vendors, and even by different vendors, that mechanism is not necessarily interoperable. Therefore, if you are running in a multi-vendor environment, that is most probably not suitable for you. Dcp Authentication Option. This was the right response from IETF and from academic community to solve this problem. And in fact, it does that. It solves the cryptographical agility problem. You can have different hash functions. You have key identifiers, time validity, and other things. The only thing is that it doesn't exist in practice. The specification has been around for 8 years. There are no implementations. There are no public implementations, and none of the vendors have serious plans to support that. There are, however, some private implementations by some large operators. However, that is not public, and there doesn't appear to be plans that this will be opened. So what do we have now in this situation? We do have a perceivably broken mechanism which is universally used and more or less works, and we have a perfect solution which can work but is not implemented. And if we talk to vendors, the answer is very simple. None of the customers is asking us to do that, and we are not a charity house. We will not implement if customers are not lining up and showing us the money. And then there are some niche mechanisms which are vendor proprietary, and of course we cannot talk about any interoperability in that case. If we look at the summary of the best practices which got developed by the field around this topic over the years, so manipulations of the time to live, both in the up and down direction, the GTSM and things like that, is the recommended practice. So if your TTL is set properly, it's really, in fact, it's really hard for others to get into your session, and that is enough to at least address this problem. Proper filtering and proper network design is a must in any practical deployment. Graceful restart addresses the remaining parts of these problems. On the other hand, you need to stay practical. If you try to over-engineer that solution, probably what you will gain is a huge increase in complexity for no added value of that. If we forget that for a moment and look into the requirements, what is needed for the transport security for the routing protocols and BGP in particular, and there appear to be 4 large groups. First, that session can live for a long time. That might be years, that might be decades. It does not necessarily mean that it is a good idea to run your network elements with the software unpatched for a decade. However, we see some developments where things like software changes without disrupting the actual state can happen. And that probably will become more common as time goes. Then a need to select a different hashing function algorithm, not necessarily MD5, but something of your choice. And in fact, there are environments which are very picky about what they choose for the crypto things. Then one of the practical problems is how do you synchronize the initial key? How many times you had to call somebody over the phone and say, so is that the password secret 123 and not secret 231? And then the mechanism is needed for rolling over the key, changing from one key to the other without actually disrupting the session. If we look at the developments in the industry related to transport, to different transports. The first obvious choice might seem that's TLS. So TLS is universally accepted. TLS solves most of the security-related aspects, and overall it has widespread implementation base. However, TLS as such doesn't protect the transport session header, the TCP header in this case, and therefore it's not the right mechanism for the use case in BGP environment. If we are using key derivation based from a certificate, certificates do have their validity time. And even if that lifetime might be long, it's still a finite lifetime. And therefore, for environments which have a long-lasting sessions, that again might not be a suitable mechanism. We can use IPsec. It works, it has been for long, and in general, the security community is happy about that. The only aspect is that in most practical implementations, that's a tunnel, and running BGP over the tunnel, while it perfectly works, this is additional complexity. You need to be careful that you don't start learning the endpoint of the tunnel over the same tunnel again. And therefore, this is addition to your policies. Then QUIC is a new emerging transport protocol which looks very promising. Which is something like a mix of intermixing UDP with TLS and applying a large amount of duct tape and to hold that together. And this, in fact, looks promising from a perspective that we might solve the transport problems in one go and in the right way, which can be both reused for other purposes, and the security community will be happy with that. And of course, as engineers, we always can invent another transport for BGP. Yes, that's huge fun. We can spend another decade of trying to do that right, and eventually it will look like some other existing solutions. There's MACsec, which is on a different layer of networking, and potentially that can work. However, you cannot assume that everything in the world is Ethernet, and for everything in the Ethernet world, you have an authority to control. So, trying to summarize all of this, even the most fancy and capable protocol engineering is not substitute for proper network design and for proper operational hygiene. And overall, as an industry, we do have a suitable mechanism, which is a TCP authentication option. However, that is not implemented, and this is one of the open questions that I would like to discuss with you. What's your feeling about this? Can you actually stand up and show enough of money to the vendors to implement that? And or whether we need something else. And if we're talking about that something else, most probably if TCP/AO doesn't take off, that will be running BGP and other control plane protocols over quick. So, open questions. First one, do you care about this? Is this a problem in your environment? Are you still happy running MD5 and you simply do not care about that? And if you care, so a few of the groups for the discussion. What about the mechanism which would allow you to synchronize the initial secret or initial password instead of using AVN carriers or regular phone? The protocol would have some machinery to exchange the passwords configured on both ends. What about the long-lived sessions? How long-lived BGP session is? Is that 1 year? Is that 10 years? Is that something longer? What about the key rotation? How frequently do you rotate the key? So do you configure Cisco 123 on both sides and for 5 years you live happily just because somebody forgot that? What about cryptographical algorithms? Are you happy with MD5? Do you need something else? What to do with TCP authentication option? Well, again, it exists in theory, it doesn't exist in practice. And what do you think of running BGP over some different alternative transports? So that's the end of propaganda from my side. Those are the questions for you. I would really like to see some discussion or at least some responses to that. Although I might guess that this is the more fundamental question. Do you care? Well, apparently no, and we can declare victory then. Any thoughts, any feedback? All right, I think that email certainly has a priority over BGP security, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Yes, everyone is pretending that they are very busy configuring BGP sessions, indeed. All right, colleagues, thank you for your time. That's what I had from my side, and I think that this adds one more small stone into the bucket of TCP/AO, and just carries it down to the bottom a little bit more. Thank you.